They had crossed mountains before and marched through valleys in their own country, but nothing prepared them for the moment the transport truck stopped near a quiet overlook in Arizona, and they were led toward a railing where the ground simply disappeared, revealing a vast chasm carved deep into the earth, layer upon layer of stone descending into shadow. And as the German prisoners stepped closer and looked down into a canyon so immense it seemed unreal, many of them struggled to understand how something so enormous could exist in silence beneath an open sky. The approach to the overlook gave little warning of what waited beyond it. The road wound steadily across dry Arizona terrain, bordered by low shrubs and scattered rock formations that rose modestly from the ground. The landscape appeared wide yet contained, marked by distant mesas and pale desert tones under a bright, uninterrupted sky. Nothing in those final miles suggested that the earth itself would soon fall away. When the truck slowed near a small wooden railing set along the edge of a plateau, the prisoners stepped down carefully, boots pressing against firm, sun-warmed stone. The air felt thinner and drier than the humid coast they had seen before. Wind moved lightly across the open space, carrying fine dust and the faint scent of heated rock. They walked forward in measured steps, guided but not hurried. From several yards back, the terrain appeared level, offering no dramatic shift. Then, almost abruptly, the ground ended. The surface dropped away into an immense void that seemed to stretch beyond comprehension. The first impression was not depth, but absence. Where solid earth had been expected, there was open space descending sharply into shadow and light. The canyon walls unfolded in layers of red, orange, and pale stone, each stratum distinct yet blended into a continuous formation that reached far below the edge where they stood. The scale resisted immediate understanding. Several men halted instinctively before reaching the railing. Their eyes moved downward and outward simultaneously, attempting to trace the contours of the chasm. What they saw was not a single valley, but a network of ridges and cliffs carved into intricate shapes. The formations appeared sculpted by forces beyond ordinary erosion, rising and descending in patterns too vast to absorb at once. Far below, a thin ribbon of water could be seen cutting through the canyon floor, its presence almost delicate compared to the surrounding mass of stone. The river's movement was barely visible from that height, yet it represented the patient force that had shaped the terrain over centuries. The prisoners understood in abstract terms that such formations required immense time, but standing at the edge, the concept felt immediate. The wind intensified slightly, rising from the depths and brushing against their clothing. It carried no sound of machinery, no echo of urban noise. The canyon remained quiet, absorbing light and shadow without disturbance. Even voices spoken softly near the railing seemed to dissipate into open space. Unlike the ocean's horizontal expanse, the canyon emphasized vertical descent. The eye was drawn downward along sheer cliffs and stepped plateaus, then outward again to distant walls on the opposite side. Those far edges appeared almost unreal, softened by atmospheric haze that made them seem suspended rather than solid. One prisoner gripped the wooden railing lightly, not out of fear, but to anchor perspective. The depth beneath him created a subtle imbalance, as though the body struggled to reconcile the scale with physical stability. There was no visible bottom in a single glance. The terrain shifted continuously between shadowed recesses and sunlit ridges. Behind them, the desert plateau stretched flat and ordinary. Before them, the earth opened into immensity. The contrast felt abrupt and unsettling. Nothing in the preceding landscape had hinted at such magnitude concealed just beyond sight. Civilians stood at intervals along the edge, observing quietly. Some took photographs. Others leaned forward with practiced familiarity. For them, the canyon represented a destination long known. For the prisoners, it felt like encountering a rupture in the ground itself. Inside the camp, Space was measured in straight lines and controlled distances. Here, measurement seemed impossible. The canyon did not reveal its dimensions easily. It demanded time to absorb, and even then it resisted comprehension. Standing at that Arizona overlook, the men confronted scale not merely in breadth, but in depth. The earth had opened into a vast corridor carved by unseen persistence, layered with color and shadow. And in facing that immense drop beneath open sky, they understood that this landscape operated on a scale far beyond fences, schedules, or immediate war, a silent monument to time itself. After the first moments of stillness, the prisoners began to move slowly along the rim under quiet supervision, each step revealing a slightly altered perspective of the canyon's vast interior. The formations did not remain fixed in appearance. As they shifted position, new ridges emerged, shadowed recesses deepened, and distant plateaus seemed to rearrange themselves against the light. The scale resisted a single, stable image. The sun hung high above, casting sharp contrasts along the canyon walls. Layers of stone appeared stacked in visible bands, each color marking a different era embedded in rock. The men traced those lines with their eyes, attempting to follow them downward. The bands narrowed as they descended, compressing centuries into thin stripes of red and pale gray. Time felt tangible here, pressed into the earth itself. Unlike the shoreline, where motion defined the landscape, the canyon felt suspended in permanence. Nothing moved visibly within its depths except faint shifting shadows as clouds passed overhead. The stillness carried weight. It suggested endurance rather than rhythm. One prisoner leaned forward slightly, trying to gauge the river below. From the rim, the water appeared no wider than a thread, its presence almost delicate compared to the immensity of surrounding rock. Yet they knew it was that river, over countless years, that had carved the canyon's depth. The idea that something so narrow could shape something so vast unsettled them in quiet reflection. The wind rose intermittently from below, brushing upward along the cliff face before dispersing across the plateau. It carried a dry, mineral scent and the faint echo of space. The air felt different here, less humid than the coast, lighter yet sharper. Each breath seemed to draw in heat stored in stone. Civilians nearby moved calmly along marked paths, pausing at designated viewpoints. Some consulted guidebooks. Others stood silently, absorbing the panorama. The prisoners observed how naturally visitors navigated the edge, stepping close to railings without visible hesitation. Familiarity reduced intimidation. For the men, however, the drop remained difficult to reconcile. Inside the camp, terrain was predictable and flat. Elevation changed only slightly, and sightlines ended at fence posts or watchtowers. Here, the ground itself had opened dramatically, revealing depth that defied enclosure. One of the prisoners commented quietly that no wall could span such a distance. The canyon's width extended far beyond visible structures. Even the opposite rim appeared softened by distance, its features blurred by haze. The space between edges felt immeasurable. As they continued along the rim, they noticed how perspective shifted depending on angle. Certain rock towers appeared massive from one vantage point, then diminished as they moved a few yards further. Light and shadow reshaped perception constantly. The canyon did not offer a fixed image. It demanded observation from multiple positions. The guards remained composed, maintaining clear boundaries without urgency. The men were permitted to approach the railing, to look, to absorb. There was no commentary offered. The experience unfolded without explanation, as if the canyon required none. Far below, the river glinted briefly in sunlight before disappearing into shadow again. The movement was subtle, barely perceptible. It contrasted with the ocean's visible motion. Here, change was slower, measured not in seconds, but in geological scale. Standing along the rim, the prisoners felt both elevated and diminished. elevated by height above the desert floor, diminished by the immensity stretching outward and downward. The canyon's scale resisted comparison to any landscape they had known. Inside the camp, confinement compressed space into defined segments. Here, space expanded beyond practical measure. Depth replaced distance as the dominant force. As the sun began its gradual descent westward, shadows lengthened along the canyon walls, emphasizing texture and form. The layered stone deepened in color, shifting subtly toward darker tones. The men understood that they were witnessing not merely scenery, but evidence of time carved into earth, vast, silent, and indifferent to human conflict. And as they stood there under Arizona light, the canyon revealed itself as something almost impossible to grasp fully, a reminder that certain scales exist beyond the boundaries imposed by wire or war. As the afternoon advanced, the sun shifted slightly westward, altering the way light settled across the canyon's interior. What had appeared sharply defined earlier now softened along certain ridges, while other formations emerged more prominently from shadow. The landscape did not change in structure, yet its appearance transformed continuously as light moved across stone. The prisoners remained near the railing, each drawn into private observation. Some focused on distant plateaus rising in isolated tiers, their edges appearing almost architectural against the sky. Others studied the sheer vertical drops directly below, where the rock face descended in near straight lines before breaking into angled ledges. The depth beneath them remained difficult to comprehend fully. A faint haze hovered between the opposing walls of the canyon, blurring outlines at great distance. The far rim seemed less solid than the edge on which they stood, as though suspended in air rather than anchored to ground. The illusion of scale unsettled perspective. Objects that appeared close were separated by miles of empty space. Unlike the ocean's horizontal sweep, the canyon demanded downward focus. The eye traveled from the rim to the layered interior, tracing shadows that pooled in crevices and bright surfaces that caught direct sunlight. The river, though barely visible, marked the lowest point, winding through stone like a narrow thread. Its presence emphasized the vastness surrounding it. One of the men remarked quietly that if a person were placed at the canyon floor, he would vanish entirely from view. The height rendered individuals invisible. From the rim, human presence seemed insignificant compared to the surrounding formation. The canyon did not accommodate scale easily. It diminished it. Wind rose again from below, carrying warmth stored in stone throughout the day. It moved upward along the cliff face and dispersed across the plateau where they stood. The sensation reinforced depth, as though the canyon breathed outward from its interior. Visitors nearby continued to move calmly along designated paths. Some pointed toward distinctive formations identified by name and printed guides. Others remained still, absorbing the panorama in silence. The prisoners noticed how the civilians did not rush the experience. The canyon invited prolonged observation rather than quick inspection. The guards maintained steady distance, allowing the men to remain at the overlook without visible tension. The absence of urgency gave the encounter a quiet gravity. No one spoke loudly. Even ordinary conversation seemed muted in the presence of such scale. Inside the camp, space had been defined by repetition and boundary. Movement followed predictable routes between structures. Here, there were no straight lines enclosing the terrain. The canyon's contours curved and descended unpredictably, shaped by forces that operated over centuries rather than hours. As light shifted further, certain rock faces deepened in color, appearing almost red against the pale sky. Other sections faded into cooler tones, their outlines blending softly into shadow. The interplay between illumination and depth created an illusion of motion, though the stone itself remained unmoving. Several of the prisoners stepped slightly back from the railing, not out of fear, but from sensory overload. The magnitude resisted immediate assimilation. It required distance to process. Standing too close intensified the sense of imbalance. Looking outward once more, they understood that this landscape did not conform to human design. It had not been built or planned. It existed as evidence of time unfolding at a scale beyond immediate experience. The canyon did not announce its age, yet its layers suggested endurance far older than the present conflict. In that Arizona afternoon, suspended between sky and stone, the men confronted depth that dwarfed both camp and continent. The canyon offered no movement, no applause, no sound beyond wind. Yet its silence carried weight. It revealed how vast the earth could be when measured not by boundaries, but by centuries of quiet transformation beneath an open sky. As the sun moved lower, the canyon began to transform in tone rather than shape. Light no longer struck the stone directly from above, but entered at an angle, casting elongated shadows that stretched across ridges and settled deeply into recesses. The formations that had appeared sharp and distinct earlier now seemed layered in softer contrast, their edges less abrupt, yet more dramatic in depth. The prisoners remained along the rim, noticing how quickly perspective could shift with the changing light. Certain rock towers that had dominated the view during midday now blended into darker plains, while previously unnoticed ledges emerged as focal points. The canyon did not remain static to the eye. It demanded continued observation. The river below reflected a faint glimmer before disappearing once more beneath shadowed walls. From such height, its movement remained invisible, yet the men understood that it persisted regardless of what they could see. That realization carried quiet symbolism. The most powerful forces shaping the canyon were subtle and prolonged, not immediate or loud. Wind intensified slightly as heat began to lift from the stone surfaces. It traveled upward from the depths, brushing against their faces and clothing. The sensation reinforced vertical scale, as if the canyon exhaled from below. There was no echo of voices returning from its interior. Sound dissipated into open air. One prisoner stepped back several paces from the railing, turning briefly to look across the flat plateau behind them. The desert terrain appeared almost ordinary in comparison: low shrubs, scattered rock, distant mesas. The dramatic drop lay concealed just beyond a short stretch of ground. The abrupt transition between flat earth and immense void felt almost unnatural. Civilians began to gather more closely along specific viewpoints as the late light intensified color. Cameras were raised. Quiet conversations continued. The canyon had entered a phase where its hues deepened toward red and gold, the stone absorbing the final warmth of the day. For visitors accustomed to this phenomenon, it marked a familiar highlight. For the prisoners, it amplified the sense of unreality. Inside the camp, time was marked by whistle and roll call. Here, time was marked by shadow length and shifting color. The canyon offered no signal beyond gradual transformation. There was no schedule dictating when it would appear most dramatic. The change occurred naturally, independent of instruction. One of the guards checked his watch discreetly, indicating that departure would soon follow. The men sensed that their time at the overlook was nearing its end. Several took one last sustained look downward, tracing the contours they had tried to understand since arrival. The immensity remained impossible to calculate. Depth and distance merged into a continuous descent that defied ordinary measurement. Even standing still, they felt as though the ground beneath them carried weight accumulated over centuries. As the first hints of dusk colored the sky, the canyon's interior darkened rapidly. The far rim faded into silhouette, its details swallowed by shadow. The scale remained, yet its visibility diminished. What had been overwhelming in daylight now became mysterious in fading light. Turning away from the railing, the prisoners walked slowly back toward the truck. The plateau felt unexpectedly narrow compared to the space they had just faced. The desert air cooled slightly, as evening approached. Before climbing into the vehicle, several glanced back once more at the darkening chasm. The canyon no longer blazed with color. It stood quiet and immense, absorbing light without effort. In that final glance, they recognized that the canyon did not belong to the moment they had spent there. It would remain unchanged tomorrow and long after, shaped not by events of a single war, but by processes far older and slower. And as they prepared to leave, the silence of that vast depth lingered more strongly than any sound, reminding them of a scale beyond fences and far beyond immediate conflict. The return from the overlook felt heavier than the arrival, though nothing in their circumstances had changed. The truck's engine started with familiar vibration, and the men climbed into the back without hesitation. As it pulled away from the plateau, the canyon remained visible for several moments, its darkening interior framed briefly against the fading sky before low terrain gradually concealed it from view. Through the open rear of the truck, the last bands of red stone softened into shadow. The immense chasm that had dominated their sight for hours reduced slowly to a thin line on the horizon, then vanished entirely behind scrub and rising ground. The disappearance felt abrupt. Something vast had been removed from sight in seconds. The road back across Arizona's dry landscape appeared unremarkable by comparison. The terrain flattened into long stretches of desert brush and distant mesas, shapes that now seemed modest after the canyon's depth. The prisoners sat quietly, the rhythm of the engine replacing the silence of open space. One of them leaned slightly toward the side of the truck, looking outward as the plateau receded. His expression remained controlled, yet thoughtful. The canyon had not offered escape, nor had it altered their confinement. Yet its magnitude lingered internally, difficult to dismiss. As the vehicle approached more familiar territory, signs of infrastructure reappeared: road markers, utility lines, small clusters of buildings in the distance. Each element restored proportion to their surroundings. Human structures returned scale to manageable dimensions. When the camp's perimeter finally came into view, fences and watchtowers stood in deliberate contrast to what they had just witnessed. The straight lines of wire and timber appeared almost fragile against memory of layered stone walls carved by centuries. Yet within those lines, their lives remained contained. The truck passed through the gate, gravel crunching beneath its tires. The routine of return unfolded precisely as always. Names were checked, movements accounted for, barracks assigned. Nothing in procedure acknowledged the depth they had stood above hours earlier. Inside the bunkhouse that evening, the air felt enclosed in a new way. Wooden walls and narrow aisles confined movement tightly. The men lay on their bunks, eyes open longer than usual, replaying the descent of rock into shadow, the layered bands of stone, the thin river carving silently below. Several reflected on the paradox of scale. In the canyon, human presence had seemed insignificant, reduced by height and distance. In the camp, human systems controlled every step and hour. The canyon dwarfed them physically. The camp constrained them practically. One prisoner remarked quietly that even if the entire camp were placed within that chasm, it would vanish from sight. The thought carried no rebellion, only perspective. The canyon existed independent of politics, armies, or borders. It had endured long before the present conflict and would remain long after. Outside, evening settled over the compound. The sky above the barracks darkened gradually, yet even there, the stars would appear in familiar patterns unaffected by the war below. The memory of standing at the rim lingered not as spectacle, but as scale, vertical depth stretching far beyond immediate reach. And as the men closed their eyes beneath the camp's low ceiling, the image of layered stone descending into quiet shadow remained fixed in thought, a reminder that beyond fences and routine, the earth itself held spaces too vast to measure, shaped not by command, but by time. The canyon did not alter their confinement. and it did not erase the wire that defined their daily existence. Yet it changed something quieter within them. For a few hours on an Arizona plateau, they had stood before a depth so immense that ordinary measurements lost meaning. The earth had opened beneath their feet into layers shaped by centuries, silent and indifferent to present conflict. Inside the camp, boundaries were clear and deliberate. Paths ended at fences. Movement followed instruction. Time was divided into precise segments marked by routine. At the canyon's rim, however, scale overwhelmed structure. Depth extended beyond sight, and the horizon curved without interruption. No wall could contain it. No schedule could reduce it. What lingered most was not the color of the stone or the faint glimmer of the river below, but the realization that some landscapes exist entirely outside human design. The canyon had not been built. It had been revealed, carved gradually by forces patient enough to outlast empires. Standing at its edge, they had glimpsed a world measured not in days or campaigns, but in geological time. The war remained immediate. The camp remained firm. Yet beyond those confines lay terrain so vast that it diminished both prison and conflict to smaller scale. The canyon did not offer comfort or escape. It offered perspective. Years later, when memories softened the rigid details of confinement, some might still recall the sensation of looking downward into open depth under a wide Arizona sky. They might remember how silence carried weight, how layers of stone recorded centuries beyond their own lifetimes. The fences would one day disappear, the routines would fade, but the canyon would remain, vast, silent, and immeasurable, reminding them that beyond the boundaries of any single moment, the earth holds spaces too large to be confined, too enduring to be altered by the events of one war. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.